Warwick had doubled in size in the period of time that I spent in America. I was a history student, and if you'd done well in your first year examinations, you got the opportunity to go on the American exchange. And I was told that I couldn't go to the University of Southern Carolina. I will show you photographic evidence later, if you wish to see it, of why I was banned from that particular institution. It doesn't look it now, but I had about 4 foot of hair that grew as an afro. Anyway, when I came back from Chicago, the university had doubled in size. When I came here, it was the same size as when Richard was here, about 900 students. And I thought the best way to introduce myself to the permissive society was by standing as president of the union. And this was when the student union building, well actually the student union office, was on the top floor of Roots Hall. And Roots Hall was the only social environment that we had. And with the help of a couple of my friends, removing other people's posters in order to put my posters up, advertising my particular mandate for the Viking Renaissance Party, I managed also to co-opt a number of other people who were as disinterested as I was in student politics. These were largely the dope freaks, and there were a lot of them back then, and the drunks. So I knew a lot of the drunks and knew a lot of the dope freaks. I sort of moved between both camps with equal fluidity. And what I did was I persuaded people to stand themselves as president, but to put me as their next option. So all of those people would get their friends to vote, and therefore, once they were booted out, I became the nominee, and I won on the 34th transfer of votes. Now, my intention was to disrupt the student union completely and to resign on the 31st of August. But something pricked my conscience. I'm not sure what it was, but I decided to see it out. Partly because this was a dreadful place. It really was. When I arrived here for the first time, actually the very first time, I came in '69 on a history politics open day. I was interested in the history course. I should have been here earlier, but I was doing something else at the time for the National Youth Theatre. So instead I came up for the History Politics Open Day and met a girl from a school nearby. A very pleasant experience on the day until I got to Dirty Dick's in Liverpool Street in my attempt to get back to Ipswich. And I had to spend the evening in Bishopsgate Police Station after punching a policeman. I'll fill you in on more of that if you're interested later. But when I actually turned up here in 1970, these buildings were not here. This was probably the largest building site in Europe. And when Richard was announced, the details of his career, I knew I'd seen you somewhere. I was the HR director at Costain and then at Bechtel. And Bechtel was the program manager of the Channel Tunnel. So I knew I'd seen you somewhere on a site somewhere. Anyway, I turned up here and it was just a building site. And it was a place where nobody seemed to stay at the weekend. It was a dreadful place to be. And so I set myself the challenge of making this an attractive place to be at the weekend. And we set out to get groups to come here and play. Didn't always work out. I'd seen a group playing in a pub in London and I thought they were bloody good. And I had a word with them and said, do you want to come up play at Warwick? They said yes. I got back here and announced to the Ents Committee, which was chaired by a guy called David Nellist, who ended up being a Labour MP in Coventry. And he and his friend Les voided my booking of Roxy Music, who about 3 weeks after they'd voided the contract, went to #1, I think, with Virginia Plain. So I knew what I was doing, but not everybody else was on my side. So the place was very different in a whole heap of ways. The country was very different. It's odd looking at the country now, particularly a night after an election, that seeing people who would not be shown the door of a toilet elected to Parliament. Back in the 70s, the early 70s, there was a degree of consensus between political parties about what decency meant. What there was not consensus about was the role of industry and commerce in academia. And that's what had caused all sorts of disruption here in the late 60s, early 70s. And the benign Jack Butterworth, who was not benign, he was as slippery as Richard Nixon, the then President of the United States. He was a cunning soul, was Jack, very charming, but equally very dangerous. Now, the world, or the main political parties, did accept something to do with like the welfare state. The Conservative Party actually supported the welfare state. What they didn't support, though, was revolting students. And we were bloody good at revolting. We were bloody good at mobilizing and going on demonstrations. And there was a lot of disruption in the world. It wasn't just Vietnam. You know, this was the time of the Cold War. This was the era of the Prague Spring. You know, there was a lot of confrontation in the world, a different form of confrontation maybe. And I feel almost apologetic standing here now as a representative of your grandparents' generation, because we went to sleep on the job in the years after I graduated. And by going to sleep on the job, it allowed for the leather-tongued oracles like Farage to sneak in. So you guys have got to stay awake and have got to push back and have got to ensure that academic freedom remains protected. I've got a very good friend whom I met when I was in Chicago, a guy called Paul Finkelman, who's now a professor of constitutional history at Harvard. At Harvard, the only university in the States that stood up to the buffoon. It's imperative that you do these things, that you don't let those who have, I think, bastardized and ruined the world continue with what they're doing. The one who kicked it all off, in my book, was Margaret Hilda Thatcher. And she turned up to open an extension at the Arnold Lodge Preparatory School in Leamington Spa. I was sat in the bar the night before she did it, and someone came in and said, "There's a telephone call for you, Louis." So I went upstairs to take the telephone call, and it was a journalist from one of the Birmingham rags, and he told me that Margaret Thatcher was coming to Leamington tomorrow. "Are you going to mobilize the student body?" "Of course," I said. "There'll be hundreds of us, if not thousands." "Oh, no, there won't," he said. I said, "Yes, there will. My students love me." So the next day, I turned up with a guy called Ted Lewis, who is my connection to Phil Dixon, but he'll tell you about that later. Because Ted could drive and I couldn't. And we took the union van with 4 other people, and we were a token picket of 6 people. What had happened in the intervening period, however, was that the journalists from Birmingham had told the police that hundreds of students were going to be descending on Leamington to cause massive amounts of disruption, which had happened the year before when she had been there. And there were hundreds of students, and I think it made the front page of newspapers all over the place. Well, when we turned up, there must have been 600-700 policemen in a chain around Leamington Station, arms locked, and they were preventing anyone from going to or coming from the station. Commuters were prevented from getting to their jobs in Birmingham. And I looked upon this as a golden opportunity. So when I was interviewed by the television cameras, I stood there with my 4 foot of hair, and I said, straight-faced, I think this is a terrible waste of taxpayers' money. It's an abuse of democracy. And I knew I was having a laugh, but I was also making a serious point. And the problem is that we were hated. Students were hated. We weren't like you. We didn't look clean. Look at the photographs of them there. We smelled. We wore Afghan coats and boots that some people never took their boots off because the smell was so bloody awful. And you could probably smell some of us from yards away. That's what we were like. We weren't model citizens as today. And because we looked so different from the kids in Coventry, when Lanchester Polytechnic closed its doors, which they did at the start of my presidency, all of the kids from Coventry, from Leamington, from Warwick, flooded to the campus because there was no security here. There were 3 or 4 guys in theory protecting the student body, but they were really not up for it. And I know that I look lovely and cuddly, but back then I wasn't. You know, I'm from the East End and I know how to look after myself. So when they called me and said there's trouble in the airport lounge, I went over, and I went over with a gift that my sister had brought back from me from Florence. She'd been out to visit a friend of mine who she was going out with at the time in Venice, another historian. And she'd come back with a mace. The wooden mace, so high, it's got 2 wooden balls on it and studs in it. And I was told that there were 20 or 30 guys beating the living daylights out of students. So I went over with my mace, and I came back without one of the studs. But they left the building. Some years later, a former president of Warwick, a guy called Frank Devine, who probably came, Frank, you're there. I didn't recognize you, Frank. So Frank was in my boss's office, and he was sitting in the corner. And my boss was a terrifying individual. And I got the message from his secretary saying, Louis, Mike wants to see you. So I go into Mike's office, and I stood in the doorway. And I'm facing Mike. Frank was there in the corner, and I didn't see him. And Mike said, did you clear a disco of Hell's Angels? Now, I was in my 50s at the time, and I hadn't remembered clearing a disco of Hell's Angels in the 2 or 3 previous weeks. And I said, what are you going on about? And he said, Frank said you cleared a disco of Hell's Angels. Well, thank you, Frank, for overstating the case. They just had leather jackets. But yeah, I cleared the disco. It's a wonderful thing to be a student. You don't realize the amount of freedom that you've got, the opportunities that you've got. So when I was here, I had opportunities to go and listen to people like Germaine Greer lecture. It wasn't my discipline. I was an historian, but I could go and access leading academics. I passed that message on to my children. My son, who is now a postgraduate fellow at La Timone in Marseille, and his first degree was in chemistry, came back after his first term and said, I conducted an orchestra last weekend, and I haven't missed a single music lecture. And I thought, that's my boy. The baton has been passed to you. Make sure you make use of it.